slow talker? Okay, so let me know in the back, just wave and I'll microphone it if need be. Mr. Ellis, I saw you, we were at the same dinner table last night, and I did not get the chance to say hello. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining and for everything that you've done to make this lecture series possible. I've looked at the list of speakers that you've had, just the ones that are available online, and it's pretty clear that this is a vibrant moment. I'm so honored to be included amongst this list, and I have to tell you that it's unsettling, in part because you all have the amazing opportunity to have the depth in rhetoric as undergraduate students that I've never experienced anywhere in the various places that I've worked. I've always worked in rhetoric programs, rhetoric departments, but we maybe have 3 or 4 classes, and a handful of students, you all have this depth. And so to think about talking with undergraduate students and knowing that you know this discipline gives me a little bit of pause. And also, this is just an incredible honor, right? So for you to be here on this day, spending your time with me, just reminds me that there's a reason why I love this work that we do and these spaces that we inhabit together, and that is because they offer us the opportunity to think and grow together. I want to thank Professor Abbott for all the work that she did to put this visit together, for answering my endless questions. I'm a little bit controlling and have a bit of anxiety, so I feel like, well, what about this, and what about this, and what about this? So incredible patience and just an amazing time here today. So with that, I want to take you through, and maybe the unsettling piece is that I'm doing a bit of a risk here in this talk on capital grounds. Normally in my discipline, we script the whole thing and then we read it, right? And that just seems like not the way to spend your lunch hour. It's kind of listen to me read. So I'm going to try to talk it. We'll see how that goes. I'm going to miss up some pieces. I'm going to forget some pieces. But I'm also sharing something that's in progress, and I don't typically do that. So we're going to just talk some ideas with that. Okay. So I want to start in the summer of 2018. I am tasked with writing the conclusion to the book. Now, I don't know if you've written conclusions for your papers. I don't know if you have to think as much as I do, but when I have to write a conclusion, whether it's to an essay, it needs to be 2 pages, or in this case, to a book, I'm sort of like, I'm done. I said what I need to say. I don't want to do it anymore. I just want to be done, right? But now I'm writing the first book, and the only book that I've written, and I have to write like a 30, 40-page conclusion. Seriously, this is right? But this is the job. So this is what I have to do, right? So I'm staring at the blank page thinking, right? The book looked at historic narratives of Mexican migrants from the 1920s through the 1950s. I chose that time period because it's a really crucial time in U.S. history. It's called, in Latinx scholars, especially historians, call it the years of the immigration regime. It's a time in which everything changed around Mexican migration to the United States. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time there. I'm going to go back to some pieces of that piece here today. But because I've been writing this book in 2018, I've been writing it for about 18 years, right? So not fast. But I've been in the 1920s to the 1950s for most of my scholarly time. And people kept asking me, well, what do you think about this happening on the border? What do you think about this on migration? I was like, I don't know. I'm in the 1940s. People like, you're asking me this. I don't know. I can tell you about the 1940s. But then it was the summer of 2018, and maybe the summer of 2018 isn't punctuated for you in the ways it was punctuated for me, but it became punctuated for me by this viral spectacle of family separation in caged children, right? And, well, I had a conclusion to write. So I paused, and I had to pay attention. Because I knew that what I needed to do was make 1920 through 1950 relevant to the moment. And caged children were there. For many of us, myself included, it felt really, really new. For many of us, myself included, it was the first that I knew of an ongoing, long-standing practice. In 2018, in the circles that I move in, the blame went to President Trump. But this was not unique to Trump. He did not invent it, nor was he the first to invent it. President Obama did not invent it, though he also used it, right? Those two pieces are not the point. but they're a little bit relevant to the point. And I need to name them here so that we can think broadly about what it means to think border crisis, border spectacle, and racial rhetorical criticism. Because what I want us to think about to start, and then I'll move into some of the pieces, is border spectacle. How it is that we are drawn to a rhetorical genre that does something different than other genres, right? As a rhetorician, part of my task is to think about genre and the expectations. What does it mean to prepare a lecture for this audience? What does it mean when I have to do an evening event? How do I think about going to the class? I have to think about audience, goal, process, how I go, and how it is that certain genres do certain things, right? So in 2018, for many of us, this spectacle felt new. And that the pause on that felt new piece is important, because part of what was new was a particular affective response. And I'm not sure how much you've engaged the conversations around affect. What we're talking about with affect is the social construction of emotional responses that bring communities together, right? We're not talking emotion, but when we experience it as emotion. Affect takes that emotion and thinks, how is this a political social construct that does something in society, cultivating and or disrupting community? It does more than that, but that is a piece, right? So family separation and caged children gave me a different way to think about, pushed me to think about border crisis in a different way. And I always hear crisis, please, with the scare quotes, because part of my rhetorical response is saying we call it crisis, probably not crisis, in the ways in which we're talking about. So I wanted to begin my conversation with you here with this moment of border spectacle, border crisis, in part because I imagine many of us have some sense of what happened to many of us in the summer of 2018, when we started to enter into these conversations, when we started to recognize the thousands of families that were impacted by the process of border arrest, border crossing, and border detention. You may or may not have followed it closely. I decided to, again, because I had to write a conclusion chapter. What was very interesting about the summer of 2018 was that the protest that emerged was bipartisan, right? And we live in a very partisan moment right now in U.S. politics. But the summer of 2018, on all sides, folks were responding to this moment in some interestingly overlapping ways. There were marches, there were protests, people were speaking out against the practice throughout. And what was interesting were these sort of overlaps, like high-profile Republicans spoke out against in public spaces. Former First Lady Laura Bush spoke out against it. Trump ally Reverend Franklin Graham spoke out about it. And just to give you some sense of some of these conversations, Utah Representative John Curtis spoke out, and he says, I do not believe that separating families is consistent with who we are as a country. Ted Cruz, Texas Senator, spoke out. I'll give you a second here because we are all American, regardless of our, we are rightly horrified. This must stop now. I'm going to come back to the relevance of that in a bit. Just one more example. Kevin Yoder, Kansas representative. Unimaginable what these parents are suffering. So part of being a rhetorical scholar for me is to pay attention to patterns and to see through, beyond, underneath the patterns. What was here was a pattern of shared outrage. Rightly we would be outraged, right? But what was interesting to me, the more that I read, was that we weren't outraged about the practices of detention as a country, broadly, right? We weren't outraged that there's an entire industry that makes incredible profit from detention, that this is a privatized thing. We weren't outraged that Trump had promised to the nation that he was going to focus on dangerous criminals, and yet what we saw were little children. What we were outraged by as a nation was the idea that it was children, that children were being forcibly separated, right? We were outraged by the images, by the stories of young girls changing their baby sisters' diapers. And our outrage was warranted, right? The record keeping, we were outraged by the lack of record keeping. We were outraged by a lot of this, but we were not outraged by deportation or deportability. And I think that the outrage lay largely in the spectacle, because this was not new. This is an ongoing practice. We didn't pay attention to it even, again, that's a visual you may have been paying attention all along. I'm not trying to tell you what you've been knowing, right? So shorthand's quick, right? For many of us, this felt new, right? Spectacle does that. It does something in its intensity, in its grandeur, in the way that it asks us to look, to stop and see. It's that sort of that thing we do when we're driving down the road, and now I don't have the word, right? When there's a wreck, right? And we know what happens. We stop, we look, we stare. And we don't stare and look from a space of humanity necessarily. We look in wonder, in awe, in amazement, in disgust, and we look in affect. So I knew that I had not done research on spectacle, and I knew that I needed to do research on spectacle. How had I spent all these years writing about the U.S.-Mexico border and border crises, all of which are predominantly about spectacle and not pause on spectacle? But I also knew I needed to finish this book, I needed to be done, I needed to move on, so I had to just sort of say, all right, I don't have time to think about spectacle, and I can't write about this without writing about spectacle. So I put it aside. Knowing that I'd come back, and knowing the spectacle, that there was something about spectacle that was rhetorically interesting and rhetorically important, right? So I thought today, as I thought about this time, I thought, well, I want to talk about this work that I do, this work around border crisis, and spectacle, as linked to a larger project, a larger conversation in the discipline around what we're calling racial rhetorical criticism. And so I want to sort of use border crisis, border spectacle, and the research I've been doing to think about what it would mean to do racial rhetorical criticism. In order to do so, I want to take you to the definition that I put forth in 2016, right? So I'm citing myself here. Every now and then you just have to have a little fun, right? Rhetorical criticism that is reflective about and engages the persistence of racial oppressions, logics, voices, and bodies, and that theorizes the very production of race as rhetorical. Right? So, I probably should have bolded the very production of race as rhetorical, because this is a part of racial rhetorical criticism that I hope emerges and grows, and that is this. If we, as a nation, as a community, as a group, believe that race is not biological, that it is a product of discourse, then who better to theorize race than rhetorical scholars, right? Rhetorical scholars center our expertise in studying discourse and how it works and what it does. I'm going to argue, and I'll name this here and I'll come back to it, that race is the effect of affect, right? So affect, that social production of emotion. Race is produced by that social production of emotion. And I'm going to suggest in various ways, and I'll give you, again, this is like a little bit of a teaser, that often the emotions attached that produce race are disgust and or awe. Now there's a whole range of them. But the disgust comes from the fear of race that is moving to us, too close, polluting, changing. The awe comes in the sort of possibilities of management and control. This kind of thing that in the U.S. is almost always a persistent interruption to the everyday life. Part of what I was trying to say in this piece that I wrote in 2016 was an argument to rhetorical scholars, to say that rhetorical scholars study rhetors, people who produce rhetoric, and we study their discourse. Rhetors are people. They have bodies. Bodies are raised. That would mean that the discourse that they produce is also raised. They talk to audiences who are raised, right? So even when we don't explicitly talk as rhetoricians about race, there is a sense in which we are always talking about race. We just aren't pausing to think about it. And part of what I want to say is, come on, dudes, this. We have to name these pieces. I didn't call them dudes. So I said this, and then I'm going to quit citing myself, right? Rhetorical studies is fundamentally, at its core, the study of race. Therefore, rhetorical critics must participate in the ever-expanding area of racial rhetorical criticism. I thought then, and I think now that maybe it's a bit of an overstatement, a bit of hyperbole. Sometimes you have to say things big and flashy so that you can get your pieces published. I'm sorry, that's just a part of the game that we play, right? And I thought, I can say this, everybody has to do it, because I study race, and it is what I do. So obviously, all of my work is about race. But what about my colleagues? Those who have expertise in presidential rhetoric, those who have expertise, come in and grab some lunch. Those who have expertise in social movement, those who have expertise in feminist rhetoric, those who have, rhetorical scholars do study a wide range of things, right? Do I expect everybody to stop what they're doing and study race? No, I don't, right? Well, back off, that's my stuff. No, I'm not. But I don't expect everybody to stop their work and study this little thing, but I do think, and our presidential rhetoric scholars illustrated this piece. You can't be a presidential rhetoric scholar, or a social movement scholar, or a feminist rhetoric scholar, or I can't even think of any other areas of rhetoric scholars right now, without, you can always pause to ask, what about this is racial? And I say presidential rhetoric scholars because, in 2008, presidential rhetoric scholars suddenly were like, whoa. Right, 2008, first election of President Obama, right? So presidential rhetoric scholarship has overtly shifted since 2008. But what they said then was, now let's go back and look at all the stuff we've written before. It is also about race, we just didn't name it in those ways. So part of what I'm saying is all of us can take a minute in our work to pause and ask, what about this has implications for how we think, produce, theorize race and rhetoric, right? As a rhetorical scholar, as rhetorical scholars, our tasks are to evaluate discourse, to assess it, often to come to judgment. Sometimes we're talking about metaphors and the ways in which they move us to action. Sometimes we're talking about effectiveness or persuasiveness or influence. And I guess part of what I'm saying is in that also studying race. And to give a sense of that, I want to take you to the words of Kurt Wilson, racial rhetorical scholar, who says, although politicians and jurists admit that race is a tricky concept, they continue to treat it as a matter of skin color or genetic heritage. They have failed to appreciate how racial categories are sustained in the everyday context of society. And I had a conversation with the folks, the leaders of La Alianza yesterday, and we talked really quickly about a case in Texas a while ago, trial. And as you know, in the U.S., if you're put on trial, you are guaranteed a jury of your peers. The protest came when the arrested person, Mexican-American, said, this is an all-white jury. I need a jury of my peers. Now, in the U.S., Mexican-Americans are legally white. We have been legally white since 1848. That's another conversation. It has some historical precedence. So what happened in the small town in Texas was that the courts could say, this is a jury of your peers. You're white. Okay? And so race is there, right? It was produced in the various kinds of ways. And so what Professor Wilson was telling us is that we have to think about this. Professor Eric King Watts, also a racial rhetorical scholar, says, and this piece just has been calling to me since I popped it in this talk today. We need to theorize how we become magnetized to forms of speech or performances of bodies, and how we may be repelled or disgusted. We develop habits to these practices, and I thought a lot about what it means to be magnetized, attracted to discourse, what it means to be repelled by them, what it means to have habits that form in response to them. Because I think what we do as rhetorical scholars is pay attention to the habits of discourse, not thinking about how those habits of discourse are always already racialized, gendered, and citizen, and class, and sexual, and all the intersectional pieces, right? And so I think a lot about habits, in part because one of my favorite scholars, Sarah Ahmed, writes about whiteness as habituation. And so I always then have to think about, all right, so what are my habits? Well, I like dresses and high heels. I like femininity. I feel most comfortable in high heels. Now I can tell you, and I feel like I can say this with absolute certainty, high heels are not themselves comfortable, right? And last night I was really feeling that, right? But that's how I was raised. My mother was very intentional. Cross your legs, sit like a lady, wear a dress, fly the heels, right? Every single day I developed this habit. And now I'm not even comfortable. And not even am I uncomfortable. COVID has changed that a little bit because I've been working at home for a lot of time. But I actually feel unattractive. And I cannot walk around very often in public where I'm not wearing high heels. That is how much who I am is shaped by this habit. It is actually not comfortable, but high heels are part of my comfy pants, right? So then I have to think, all right, how do we push that out? How do we think about the habituations of discourse? And I think about appearance, my performance of my body, my appearance, as a habituation of discourse. I am performing a gendered, racialized thing just by the ways I dress and move every day, right? So then I think about what are the other habituations? And I could tell you that I am magnetized to and repelled by accent, right? And I am very clear as part of my anti-racist philosophy of being that I am going to confess to you as often as possible all the ways in which I cannot escape the whiteness of my habituation. And so, Southern accents, I associate all kinds of class pieces that are not very good about them, and intelligence pieces, right? British accents, I also am magnetized toward those. They sound cultured, they sound wealthy. Whoa, that's, right? It doesn't matter what body, it's not any kind of attraction other than it calls something that maybe I wish I had, right? And so I think that part of what we do as rhetorical scholars, as racial rhetorical critics, part of what I'm hoping my colleagues in racial rhetorical criticism, whether they study race or not, start to think about how the habits of our discourses, our words, our beings, our art, our architecture, all the expansive notion of discourse, magnetize, repels, discuss in ways that are racial. In doing so, part of what I'm asking is how it is that we as rhetorical scholars reflect upon our theories and our methods and say, how do we interrupt them? How do we modify them? How do we extend them? How do we reject them through racial rhetorical lenses? And right now, as I study the U.S.-Mexico border, I'm interested in mobility and containment. The U.S.-Mexico border is a space defined by movement and stoppage. We cross, we stop. We arrest, we enter, right? So I want to think through border crisis, spectacle, mobility, and containment. I want to make sure I'm paying attention to time. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what mobility scholars in interdisciplinary ways are talking about. And so this is Dan Brower, rhetorical scholar, recently passed. Brilliant stuff. Mobility is best understood as historical production. Its meanings have been associated with freedom, opportunity, and progress, with deviance, danger, and social pathology. Whether chosen or coerced or forceful, joyful or reluctant, studies of mobility attend to movement, representations of movement, and embodied experiences of movement. And mobility studies is a relatively recent interdisciplinary conversation that has to do with where we're going, how we're getting there, how quick, how slow, whether it's joyful, whether it's frightening, right? So there's this piece about mobility that's really important and it's shaping how I'm thinking. Rhetorical scholars are also and have been studying containment. Rhetorical scholar Kristen Crow writes, containment discourses are discourses that tame a potential threat to hegemonic culture and or the norms of the status quo. And so much of the rhetorical containment literature has taken us to feminist conversations around how it is that women are expected to be mothers, and that means they have to make certain choices about careers and jobs. How it is that women presidential candidates are called all kinds of names. I've got a colleague, Professor Anderson at Colorado State University, who's got this brilliant spate of literature on badasses and bitches. And sorry, I mean, that's her language, right? So bitch is great, right? And so how it is that Hillary Clinton, this bitch, is no longer eligible to be a viable candidate for president. Hillary Clinton, this badass, is still no longer eligible to be a viable president because women are not supposed to do those things, right? We're supposed to stay in place. So containment discourses are how it is that the discourses stop our possibilities. As a border rhetoric scholar, it took me a while to recognize that if I'm studying the border, I'm studying movement and stoppage. Sometimes I'm not super quick. But the border is a site defined by movement and by stoppage. If the problem is too many people crossing, the solution is containment. So what I want to do in this next piece is take you to current moments of the U.S.-Mexico border crisis and the spectacles. And I'm gonna show you images and a couple of videos. And what I want you to do is really think at this intersection, mobility and containment. And I'm moving toward a concept that I'm currently calling static mobility. Right? Something that is neither mobility nor containment, but something in between. I have no idea what it's gonna look like in a few years, but I'm gonna take you to, I think it was September 2021. And if you recall, the outrage that emerged in response to the spectacle of the Texas Border Patrol on horses and Haitian migrants.
National Bridge in Del Rio in Texas, a camp that's become home to thousands and which reveals yet another crisis at the border in America. They cross the Rio Grande River that forms the border between the US and Mexico, most of them Haitians, willing to take the chance that they will be processed and allowed in, willing to tolerate what's been described as a squalid existence here.
There is not enough food to give to everybody who's inside there. We need to get out of the camp to look for food. Things are worse.
It is these pictures of Border Patrol agents on horseback pushing migrants into the river that have caused so much anger. For some, they carry the echoes of the worst chapters of American history.
What we witnessed takes us back hundreds of years.
Sorry, I didn't mean to go that far. Okay. And I meant to preface this by saying, I want you to aim to contain the pieces where you're called to sympathy, empathy, and I want you to focus on mobility and containment, right? I want you to be thinking about how quick, how fast, how slow, height, all the different pieces. It doesn't have to be literal movement or containment, it could be figurative movement. And just be paying attention to those pieces, okay? The next piece I want to take you to is...
Under the International Bridge in Del Rio.
Okay. At around the same time that the Texas Border Patrol aimed to stop entry into the U.S. through horses, Texas Governor Greg Abbott constructed what he called the steel wall of cars at the border. So this is September 2021, and we saw this steel wall emerge in various kinds of places. So here you can see it from looking at the cars, and again, shining on so that the movement is back. Earlier in 2021, President Biden talks about the Honduran migrant crisis, and he said, don't come. You won't get in immediately. In the text of this article, he said, let me see, it says here, don't come now. You can see French, right? So he's talking about the time, the temporal piece. But prior to this, of course, was the conversations around the caravans, right? And so I want to take you to this piece around the caravan. So this is a little bit earlier.
On the Tijuana side of the U.S.-Mexico border today, mayhem. First, it was dozens of Central American migrants racing toward the U.S. border. Then it seemed there were countless. At times overrunning Mexican authorities in riot gear, climbing their way forward somehow. And no, that's not the U.S. on the other side, but it's close. In return, pushback from the American side was swift. U.S. military helicopters buzzed overhead as it appeared some migrants attempted to breach the border. And before long, from the U.S. side, tear gas fired toward the migrants, among them what appeared to be mothers with young children, as the chaos deepened.
This word chaos is really important, and I'm hoping that we one more example, and I'm going to still not get it. Back to the cages, right? So again, my task as a rhetorical scholar is to identify the patterns and try to see what is at play underneath, in between. Try to point to the things that aren't obvious to all of us. It's pretty clear to me, as somebody who's interested in mobility and containment, that's a big part of what's going on here, right? Again, border, so of course. But the task of the rhetorical scholar is to look at the obvious mobility and containment and then ask, okay, what else? What's underneath this? What's going on here? And I go back to Professor Eric King Watts. There's something about these discourses of mobility and containment that attract, disgust, and repel. I think maybe it has to do with the comparison of the horses against the people, like the height and the force and the bigness of the horses against the seemingly smaller movements of the people, about the quickness of the horses and the slowness of walking in water when you're carrying all the things on top of you. Rhetorical scholars interested in metaphor tell us that there's something about archetypal metaphors, right? That the vertical scale is really crucial. It signals goodness and evil. It signals power and submission. It signals possibility and pitfall. That submission piece then maybe tells us why it is that the children lying on the ground was the image that got us, right? Because here what you see is the most vulnerable position a body can be in, one of the most, lying on the ground, right? So that lowness there is really critical. There's something about authority that is going on, right? When President Biden speaks, he speaks with the authority of his power as president. Right? When he speaks as the voice of the nation, there's awe in his voice as the leader of the nation. Texas Governor Abbott has access to the steel wall, to militarized force. And when have you ever heard cars described as made of steel? Like it's just not part of the conversation. So why did that have to emerge? What are we talking about? The force of steel, impenetrable steel. And then Maxine Waters is interesting here. And it's a really interesting piece because if you know Maxine Waters, you know that her goal in her political position is to interrupt the oppression that falls upon impoverished communities of color. And what happens here with the spectacle attached is that her words become part of a larger distraction. So let me take you to the pieces. And what I don't yet know what to do with these pieces, so I gotta modify this one.
What the hell are we doing here? What we witnessed takes us back hundreds of years. What we witnessed was worse than what we witnessed in slavery. Cowboys with their reins again whipping black people, Haitians, into the water where they're scrambling and falling down when all they're trying to do is escape from violence in their country.
So now let me take you here, this piece.
Canada and France and the United States treated worse than anybody else. And so, yes, we're here and we're organized and we're saying to the president and everybody else, you got to stop this madness. And I want to know, in the first place, who's paying these cowboys to do this work? They've got to be gotten rid of. They've gotten to be stopped.
That was the piece I wanted to get to. They've got to be stopped. She doesn't say now, but I hear the now. Like, we have to stop this right now, right? So that tells me, across all these pieces, that when we're looking at mobility and containment, and this thing that I'm calling static mobility, we're looking at things like tempo. We're looking at magnitude, the bigness of the horses, the chaos that I told you we were going to come back to the chaos, the constant reference to images that show lots and lots of movement that is not organized, that is frenetic, that is fast and quick, and we don't know where it's coming from. We don't know how to stop them. It's everywhere. There's something about my read of this is that the frenetic chaos that is depicted through the spectacles at the border disgust and repel. Now, we might feel empathy, but we're also sort of like, whoa, that's a little bit too much. Now this could be me, I'm a highly anxious person, I'm disturbed by too much food in my fridge, right? Things crowd, right? But I think that the depiction of the spectacle through the magnitude and the urgency of this must be stopped now also relies upon the tempo that goes back and forth and the tempo that feels as if it's coming and coming, right? And so I think that that is a big piece of what we're talking about. When we see this urgency piece,
This.
right, again and again and again, right? So this is the Del Rio, Texas mayor, and he's calling for quick action. So everywhere I go, the pattern is around the time and temporality. I'm going to take us just to this last slide here to say this. We talk about mobility and containment in rhetorical spaces a lot. And we know that there's something at play. And I know that part of what I'm going to do is move through these pieces and understand. But I want to close by asking you to think, what if mobility and containment, what if a racial rhetorical lens tells us, what if studying the border tells us that these things are not distinct, they're not separate, there is not mobility or containment, but there is something that is the same. Because what I keep seeing again and again and again, and the planes are circling above an attempt to stop. The wall is there because the people and the stop. The tear gas is being shot through the air. It's moving through the air in order to stop. Mobility and containment are not the same. And the goal of the critic is to say, our theories of mobility and containment give us a lot of promise. And when we bring the racial lens, and this is again why I think this sort of my interest in the repulsion of too much, too fast, too soon, is because I needed to stop the movement. There was something that's not even the intersection, it's the both and this, it's the simultaneity of mobility and containment that is filled with that affective response. If race is the effect of affect, if blackness is made, and I use blackness here because in U.S. racial logics, it is that piece that circulates with the greatest danger, the greatest threat. Sometimes also the greatest promise, but typically the greatest threat, right? If race is made when it feels as if it's coming too close, and I gotta stop it, right? Police violence, I gotta stop it. Then that's the piece that we have to think about because they are not separate. They are not separate, right? And so I'm interested again in building this theory so that we understand, like, if race is if it emerges from our discourse, then our task is to build theories and methods of assessing it that take us to unpacking it. So with that, I will pause and be happy to address any questions. We have a few minutes for a couple of questions.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I had a question on the idea of rhetoric being racialized. I think we all probably know America is a very heavily racialized country, right? So a lot of our rhetoric is racialized. But do you think there are spaces, one, today where rhetoric is not racialized? And do you think that if there aren't any today, we can get to that point in the future? Or should we get to that point where rhetoric is not racialized?
That is a great question. If we think that racialization I don't think so. I'll start there, right? In part because we would erase race. Because every body that speaks, right? I don't think there's escape from race, nor do I think that we would want to, right? So racialized is neither, it's not any kind of value-laden term. I think that there is this sort of, I think if we were to define a rhetorical term like eloquence, right? We would say typically eloquence looks like this. Classical rhetoric, hopefully, do y'all take classical rhetoric? Is this a real good man speaking well? I mean, I don't know, right? But what does the good man speaking well look like from any range of cultures, bodies, perspectives, right? It could look like any number of things. Our theory tends to say it looks like this. And part of racial rhetorical criticism says, what if we have 20 definitions of what eloquence looks like? And they account for Twitter, and they account for, my 13-year-old who's like, I'm low-key hungry, right? But maybe that's eloquence, right? But none of it, I think we would have to escape race. And so, but what it means to be racialized is neither, it has no necessary value attached.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So you mentioned, you brought up a quote by Kurt Wilson that said that the idea of race is sustained by everyday talk. And so I'm wondering if we take the approach that rhetoric is inherently about race, does that not risk sort of making things about race to a point where it's like, it doesn't need to be? I just know that like a common criticism I've heard is like, why are you making this about race? No one was thinking about it. No one was talking about it. It's like you're making a problem when there isn't one. Is that like a risk with this approach?
Possibly, and maybe even probably, but maybe what we would do is say, that's a habit of discourse that reflects upon a particular racial practice, right? Rather than, it's about racist dangers, it's about racist bad, it's about racist good. We simply name like the ways in which we live and speak continue to construct race as a real thing in all of its nuance. And so if we think, what would it mean to sort of say, we are truly a multivalent, multi-linguistic society that allows for a range of voices, all of which reflect different experiences, perspectives, populations, and backgrounds, right? So that when we remove, talking race is not talking racial problems, right? It's recognizing that we have habituations that emerge from somewhere they are not neutral. That it raises the universal human and says we are all located somewhere. That is a really interesting question.
Please join me in thanking